What are the possible outcomes here?
It's a great question. So the ACCC, the Australian Consumer Watchdog, in their interim gas report, had some pretty alarming news for the market next year. In its forecast for 2023, it found that the supply of gas on Australia's east coast could fall short of demand by about 56 petajoules, about 3% of total demand. Now, the ACCC has recommended that the federal minister enact or trigger the Australian Domestic Gas Security Mechanism, or ADGSM for short. If enacted, this mechanism would allow the federal minister from January next year to pressure or to force LNG exporters to prioritise their gas for the local market. Now, this exists because about 70 to 75% of all gas produced on Australia's east coast is ultimately destined for LNG export cargoes. In the forecast for next year, about 11% of all LNG exports are likely to be not covered under long-term contracts, effectively being sold into tight spot markets. And those are the cargoes that this mechanism is really trying to target to prioritise for the local market.
We saw last week the government introducing a new climate change policy. 43% emissions reduction on 2005 levels by 2030, net zero by 2050. How realistic are these targets?
It's also a difficult one to answer, but overall, if this bill is passed into legislation, it would give some sorely needed clarity to Australian investors and consumers in terms of the carbon reduction targets or efforts that are likely to lie ahead of them in the years to come, something that's been sorely missed after years of political uncertainty in Australia. But at least in our analysis, this policy in and of itself simply doesn't go far enough. If you look at the two largest sources of emissions across Australia in terms of sectors of the economy, that's the electricity sector and in transport. Last year, Australia generated roughly 23% of its electricity from renewable energy resources. And in our forecast, looking to year 2030, an additional 43 gigawatts of wind and solar capacity may be built, but this would still leave Australia shy of Labor's ambitious 82% renewable energy supply target. And in the transport sector, last year about 3% of all passenger vehicles sold were electric. We think this might increase over the 8 years to 2030 to about 23% of all new passenger vehicle sales, but this is significantly below Labor's ambitious 89% target for all new sales. And that simply is unlikely to happen without new driving policies and mechanisms, particularly tailpipe emissions standards that would force automakers to prioritise sending their EVs to Australia.